Next is electrolyte balance. Major electrolytes in our body fluids are sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, and magnesium. We mentioned several of these in chapter 18 with major minerals, the things that we need large amounts of each day. Electrolytes are unequally distributed in our body compartments, our fluid compartments. Intracellular, the positive ones are mostly potassium, and it's higher in magnesium. That should actually be 2 pluses there. Magnesium loses 2 electrons to become stable. The negatives inside the cells, you have phosphate and proteins with negative charges. The way that works is the R groups have places that can pick up extra electrons or lose a hydrogen, which leaves them with an electron from the hydrogen. Extracellular, sodium is the major positive ion. It's also higher in calcium than intracellular. The major negative ions are chloride and bicarbonate. In the plasma only, proteins like albumin have a negative charge, but the rest of the extracellular fluid doesn't have negative proteins in any significant amounts. Electrolyte intake is mostly from our food. Solid foods all have some amount of electrolytes in it. We get a lot of added salt in processed foods or by sprinkling it on, and that would be the sodium and chloride. There's not a lot of electrolytes in drinks. Fruit juices would have potassium, a sports drink would have various electrolytes in it depending on the composition they've used. Output of electrolytes is in the urine and feces. Urine is the primary method where it regulates which ones are included in the urine versus reabsorbed. Electrolytes in feces would be there if they're not absorbed from the food. For example, we don't absorb all of the calcium, or if they've been secreted in the bile. Regulation of electrolyte balance is mostly on the output side. For intake, if there's a severe deficiency, you could get a salt craving, but that has to be pretty strong. Output is regulated within the kidneys and controlled by hormones. There are many hormones involved. We'll just review the 3 that we mentioned back in chapter 13. Aldosterone. Somebody tell me where aldosterone is secreted from? Sterone narrows it down. Yep, it's from the adrenal cortex. So aldosterone says to reabsorb the sodium and in turn secrete the potassium. Parathyroid and calcitonin act on the calcium. Parathyroid to retain it, calcitonin to excrete it. And as we saw in chapter 13, they have other targets for those changes, like the bone and for parathyroid, the intestines, through vitamin D. They also both act on the kidneys and say, hold or release more of the calcium than you want. Questions on electrolytes? Acid-base balance is the last one. This one's actually broken up into a couple of sections in the textbook. The first one looks at where the acids come from, how we get rid of them, and how we regulate them. Quick review. Acid means hydrogen ions. Base means something that reduces hydrogen ions from the fluid around it, often by releasing hydroxide ions, but not always. The more hydrogen, the more acidic, but the lower the pH number. And that's because of some weird math called a logarithm that turns it into nice simple numbers like 0 through 14. So, hydrogen in the body, we get some from aerobic respiration. We produce the carbon dioxide, it gets turned into carbonic acid. But we can't avoid the acid by doing anaerobic respiration because that gives us lactic acid. If we want to burn fats, we get some ketones which can be acidic. Breaking down some amino acids creates acid. After we deaminate, take off the amine and break them down for the energy. Some of them produce more acid than others, especially the ones in meats. So for this reason, vegetarians can actually have alkaline urine because they're not producing as much acid in the body that needs to be excreted. The acid in the food isn't very important in overall balance. So you're not going to acidify yourself by drinking too much orange juice, for example. It's the metabolism that's important in creating the acid. We have 3 mechanisms for regulating blood pH. These are listed in order of how quickly they act and in reverse order of how strongly they can change it. So our first line of defense is buffers. These are molecules that can pick up excess hydrogen ions. But if there's not a lot of hydrogen around them, they can actually release the hydrogen ions they have. So they can raise or lower the pH based on needs. These include several of our negative ions, bicarbonate, phosphate, and the proteins. This is the quickest way to adjust pH. What we have here, we just change which way this goes. If there's too much acid around, this will go this way. The bicarbonate will become carbonic acid. If there's not enough hydrogen around, carbonic acid will release its hydrogen. Second mechanism is the respiratory system. This can get rid of or hold on to the carbon dioxide. That'll change this part of the equation. The more CO2 we have, the more carbonic acid we make, and then the more hydrogen can be released if needed. Whereas if we have less CO2, the carbonic acid is going to get turned back into water and CO2, taking away some of the hydrogen. And then the last is the urinary system. This is the slowest way to adjust the pH, but it can handle larger volumes and make a longer lasting difference. The kidneys can adjust how much hydrogen they secrete in the urine. The more they secrete, the more acid you get rid of, your pH goes up. So, questions on regulating pH? Acid-base imbalance is when your pH is too high or too low. Now, we usually say blood pH is 7.4. That's right in the middle of the healthy range, 7.35 to 7.45. So pretty narrow range where things still work. You go below that, it's called acidosis. Go above that, it's called alkalosis. Symptoms can easily be mistaken for other things. Acidosis involves drowsiness, disorientation, stupor, and in significant cases, cyanosis, where they go blue, especially around the lips. Sometimes you might just think you're tired. Alkalosis, dizziness, agitation, tingling sensation, and involuntary muscle contraction. So these come from the nerves or the muscles sending signals that aren't really there. Same with the agitation probably, that's just more CNS. Both can occur either by losing too much of acid or base, or gaining too much of the opposite. So acidosis can come from extra acid in your body, or it can come from losing bases. The reverse with alkalosis, it can come from losing acids or introducing too much base. And we'll take a look at some specific causes here. Acidosis and alkalosis are further classified as respiratory or metabolic. Respiratory means it's coming from the respiratory system acting differently to how it should, and you're excreting the wrong amounts of CO2. If it's too much CO2 that you're exhaling, you're losing the CO2, you lose the acid, you would get which one of the two imbalances? Alkalosis. Or if you're holding on to too much CO2, that would increase the acid and you would have acidosis. Respiratory imbalances can come from hyperventilation or holding your breath, and from poor ventilation or poor gas exchange. So any kind of obstructive respiratory disorder where the air doesn't get to the alveoli as easily, or a decreased gas exchange such as emphysema. Metabolic acidosis and alkalosis come from either making or excreting the wrong amounts of hydrogen. These can come from vomiting and diarrhea that can cause you to lose acids or bases, depending on which it is and for how long. Kidney disease, here they're not able to excrete the right amounts to keep the pH stable. And then other things going on in the metabolism, usually these lean toward creating more hydrogen, such as diabetes, where more ketones are being burned because the cells can't get the glucose, so they burn fat instead. So to look at these one at a time, respiratory acidosis is not enough CO2 being exhaled, either because it's not diffusing into the alveoli quickly enough, or you're not able to breathe fast enough to get rid of it. This can come from damage to the control centers in the CNS, so they're not setting the rate correctly, obstructive lung disease, and then gas exchange problems like emphysema, pneumonia, or pulmonary edema, which has fluid increase in the respiratory membrane, so between the alveolar and capillary walls. That makes it a longer diffusion distance. Metabolic acidosis can come from too much hydrogen being produced, such as in diabetic ketoacidosis, or too little hydrogen excreted, or too much base excreted. Kidney disease, diarrhea because buffers are lost in the feces, and prolonged vomiting where the intestinal contents are lost with it. And you're losing the buffers that are secreted into the duodenum. Questions on either type of acidosis? Respiratory alkalosis is from exhaling too much CO2. This comes from hyperventilation for many possible reasons. Anxiety, you're just breathing faster because you're worried. Fever actually increases respiratory rates. High altitude, where you're breathing faster because you need to get more oxygen, but in the process of getting more oxygen, you're exhaling more CO2. Playing brass or wind instruments where you have to breathe faster just to make the sound. And then if somebody's on a ventilator,